something I need to get off my conscience. I have killed somebody.
There are many reasons why someone would keep a secret. Perhaps it's to save face and keep them out of trouble, or maybe it's to prevent someone from experiencing heartache. Over time, however, such secrets tend to weigh on one's mind. Ultimately, those mysteries will be revealed sooner or later, and more often than not, it's on the secret holder's own deathbed. Though it may seem a bit macabre, it makes sense. People want to feel relieved of their anxieties or guilt. This way, they can clear their consciences before they go to the other side. When famed Hollywood director William Desmond Taylor was murdered in 1922, police had no idea what had transpired. 40 years later, however, an actress named Margaret Gibson made a startling confession. At 27, she was a drug addict who'd previously worked with William. Even though she was never a suspect in the case, in 1964, she confessed to a neighbor that she murdered the director. Still, it took several years for her secret to be made public. William Desmond Taylor, born William Cunningham Deane-Tanner, the 26th of April, 1872, the 1st of February, 1922, was an Anglo-Irish-American film director and actor. A popular figure in the growing Hollywood motion picture colony of the 1910 and early 1920. Taylor directed 59 silent films between 1914 and 1922 and acted in 27 between 1913 and 1915. Taylor's murder on the 1st of February, 1922, along with other Hollywood scandals such as the Roscoe Arbuckle trial, led to a frenzy of sensationalist and often fabricated newspaper reports. The murder remains an official cold case. William Cunningham Deane-Tanner was born into the Anglo-Irish gentry on the 26th of April, 1872, at Ivington House, County Carlow, Ireland, one of 5 children of a retired British Army officer, Major Kearns Deane-Tanner of the Carlow Rifles, and his wife, Jane O'Brien. Taylor's siblings were Dennis Gage Deane-Tanner, Ellen Nell Deane-Tanner Fowdle Phillips, Lizzie Daisy Deane-Tanner, and Oswald Kearns Deane-Tanner. One of his uncles was Charles Kearns Deane-Tanner, the Member of Parliament for Mid Cork. From 1885 to 1887 Taylor attended Marlborough College in England. In 1890, he left Ireland for a dude ranch in Kansas. There, Taylor became reacquainted with acting, his first experiences being at school, and eventually moved to New York City. While in New York, Taylor courted Ethel May Hamilton, an actress who had appeared in the stage musical Florodora under the name Ethel May Harrison. Hamilton's father was a broker and an investor in the English antiques store on Fifth Avenue, the Antique Shop, which eventually employed Taylor. The couple married in an Episcopal ceremony on the 7th of December, 1901 at the little church around the corner, and had a daughter, Ethel Daisy, in 1902 or 1903. Taylor and his family were well known in New York society and were members of several clubs. He was also a heavy drinker, possibly suffered from depression, and was known to carry on affairs with women. Taylor suddenly disappeared on the 23rd of October, 1908, deserting his wife and daughter. After his disappearance, friends said he had previously suffered mental lapses, and his family thought initially he had wandered off during an episode of amnesia. Taylor's wife obtained a state decree of divorce in 1912. Little is known of the years immediately following Taylor's disappearance. He traveled through Canada, Alaska and the northwestern U.S., mining gold and working with various acting troupes. Eventually, he switched from acting to producing. By the time he arrived in San Francisco around 1912, he had changed his name to William Desmond Taylor. In San Francisco, some New York acquaintances met him, and provided him with some money to re-establish himself in Los Angeles. In Hollywood, Taylor worked as a film actor starting in 1913, including 4 appearances opposite Margaret Gibson. He directed his first film, The Awakening, in 1914, as an actor-director. Over the next few years, he directed more than 50 films. Between 1914 and 1919, Taylor was engaged to actress Neva Gerber, whom he had met during the filming of The Awakening. Gerber later recalled, "He was the soul of honor, a man of personal culture, education, and refinement. I have never known a finer or better man." Around 1915, Taylor made contact with a sister-in-law, Ada Brennan Deane-Tanner, wife of Taylor's younger brother Dennis. A former British Army lieutenant and manager of New York antiques business, separate from Hamilton's, Dennis had also abandoned his wife and children, disappearing in 1912. Ada and her daughters moved to Monrovia, California, where Ada could be treated at the Pottinger Sanatorium for tuberculosis. Ada's sister, Lillian Pomeroy, was married to the sanatorium's physician in charge, Dr. John L. Pomeroy. This would become public after Taylor's murder, and the press descended upon the little town of Monrovia. Towards the end of World War I, in July 1918, Taylor enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force as a private. After training for 4.5 months at Fort Edward, Nova Scotia, Taylor sailed from Halifax on a troop transport carrying 500 Canadian soldiers. They arrived at Hounslow Barracks, London on the 2nd of December 1918. Taylor, in a 1920 photograph addressed to actress Mary Miles Minter. Taylor was ultimately assigned to the Royal Army Service Corps of the Expeditionary Forces Canteen Service, stationed at Dunkirk, and promoted to the temporary grade of lieutenant on 15 January 1919. At the end of April 1919, Taylor reached his final billet at Bergat, France, as Major Taylor, Company D, Royal Fusiliers. Upon returning to Los Angeles on the 14th of May 1919, Taylor was honored by the Motion Picture Directors Association with a formal banquet at the Los Angeles Athletic Club. After returning from military service, Taylor went on to direct some of the most popular stars of the era, including Mary Pickford, Wallace Reid, Dustin Farnham and his protégé, Mary Miles Minter, who starred in the 1919 version of Anne of Green Gables. By this time, Taylor's ex-wife and daughter were aware that he was working in Hollywood. In 1918, while watching the film Captain Alvarez, they saw Taylor appear on the screen. Ethel responded, "That's your father." In response, Ethel Daisy wrote Taylor in care of the studio. In 1921, Taylor visited his ex-wife and daughter in New York City and made Ethel Daisy his legal heir. At 7:30 a.m. on the morning of Thursday, the 2nd of February 1922, Taylor's body was found inside his bungalow at the Alvarado Court Apartments, 404 B South Alvarado Street, in Westlake, Los Angeles, a trendy and affluent neighborhood. A crowd gathered inside, and someone identifying himself as a doctor stepped forward, made a cursory examination of the body, and declared Taylor had died of a stomach hemorrhage. The doctor was never seen again. When doubts later arose, the body was rolled over by forensic investigators, revealing that the 49-year-old film director had been shot at least once in the back with what appeared to have been a small caliber pistol, which was not found at the scene. Funeral. Taylor's funeral took place on the 7th of February 1922, in St. Paul's Pro Cathedral. After an Episcopal ceremony, Taylor was interred in a mausoleum at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Hollywood Cemetery, on Santa Monica Boulevard, in Hollywood. The inscription on his crypt reads, "In memory of William C. Deane-Tanner, beloved father of Ethel Deane-Tanner. Died the 1st of February 1922. In Taylor's pockets, investigators found a wallet holding $78 in cash, adjusted for inflation in 2020 would be approximate $1,190, a silver cigarette case, a Waltham pocket watch, a penknife, and a locket bearing a photograph of actress Mabel Normand. A 2-carat diamond ring was on his finger. With the evidence of the money and valuables on Taylor's body, robbery seemingly was not the motive for the killing. However, a large but undetermined sum of cash that Taylor had shown to his accountant the day before was missing and apparently never accounted for. After some investigation, the time of Taylor's death was set at 7:50 p.m. on the evening of the 1st of February 1922. While being interviewed by the police 5 days after the director's body was found, Mary Miles Minter said that following the murder, a friend, director and actor Marshall Nealon, had told her that Taylor had made several highly delusional statements about some of his social acquaintances, including her, during the weeks before his death. She also said that Nealon thought Taylor had recently become insane. In the midst of a media circus caused by the case, Los Angeles Under-Sheriff Eugene Biscalers warned Chicago Tribune reporter Eddie Doherty, "The industry has been hurt. Stars have been ruined. Stockholders have lost millions of dollars. A lot of people are out of jobs and incensed enough to take a shot at you." According to Robert Gires, the studios seemed to be fearful that if certain aspects of the case were exposed, it would exacerbate their problems. King Vidya said of the case in 1968, "Last year I interviewed a Los Angeles police detective, William Michael Cahill, Sr., now retired, who had been assigned to the case immediately after the murder. He told me, we were doing all right and then, before a week was out, we got the word to lay off." More than a dozen individuals were eventually named as suspects by both the press and the police. Newspaper reports at the time were both overwhelmingly sensationalized and speculative, even fabricated, and the murder was used as the basis for much subsequent true crime fiction. Many inaccuracies were carried forward by later writers who used articles from the popular press as their sources. Overall, most accounts have consistently focused on 7 people as suspects and witnesses. Edward F. Sands had prior convictions for embezzlement, forgery, and serial desertion from the U.S. military. Born in Ohio, he had multiple aliases and spoke with an affected Cockney accent. He had worked as Taylor's valet and cook until 7 months before the murder. While Taylor was in Europe the summer before in 1921, Sands had forged Taylor's name on checks and wrecked his car. Later, Sands burgled Taylor's bungalow, leaving footprints on the film director's bed. Following the murder, Sands was never seen or heard from again. Henry Peavy, who replaced Sands as valet, was the person who found Taylor's body. Newspapers noted that Peavy wore flashy golf costumes, but did not own any golf clubs. 3 days before Taylor's murder, Peavy had been arrested for social vagrancy and charged with being lewd and dissolute. According to Robert Gires, even though the police decided, after severe questioning, that Peavy was not the murderer, the Hollywood correspondent of the New York Daily News, Florabel Muir, came to a private conclusion that Peavy was the murderer. In that era of ingenious women reporters, Muir thought she could engineer a scoop by tricking Peavy into a confession. She knew, from the movies, that blacks were deathly afraid of ghosts. With the help of 2 Confederates, Frank Carson and L. Wayne Shank, she offered Peavy $10 if he would identify Taylor's grave in the Hollywood Park Cemetery, which she had already visited. Wayne Shank had gone on ahead with a white sheet, and Muir and Carson drove Peavy to the site. Wayne Shank, who came from a tough section of Chicago, spoke with the accents of a hoodlum. When he loomed up in the sheet and cried out, "I am the ghost of William Desmond Taylor. You murdered me. Confess, Peavy." Henry laughed out loud. Then he cursed them roundly. Unfortunately for Muir, she was unaware that Taylor had a distinctive British accent. Wayne Shank, as Muir revealed in her memoirs, not only spoke like a hoodlum, but also was one of the Chicago mobsters who were later gunned down in the infamous Street Valentine's Day Massacre. In 1931, Peavy died in a San Francisco asylum where he had been hospitalized for syphilis-related dementia. Mabel Normand was a popular comedic actress and frequent co-star with Charlie Chaplin and Roscoe Arbuckle. According to author Robert Gyres, Taylor was deeply in love with Normand, who had originally approached him for help in curing her cocaine dependency. Based upon Normand's subsequent statements to police investigators, her repeated relapses were devastating for Taylor. According to Gyres, Taylor met with federal prosecutors shortly before his death and offered to assist them in filing charges against Normand's cocaine suppliers. Gyres expresses a belief that Normand's suppliers learned of this meeting and hired a contract killer to assassinate the director. According to Gyres, Normand suspected the reasons for her lover's murder, but did not know the identity of the triggerman. On the night of the murder, Normand claimed to have left Taylor's bungalow at 7:45 p.m. in a happy mood, carrying a book he had lent her. She and Taylor blew kisses to each other as her limousine drove her away. Normand was the last person known to have seen Taylor alive, and the Los Angeles Police Department subjected her to a grueling interrogation, but ruled her out as a suspect. Most subsequent writers have done the same. However, Normand's career had already slowed, and her reputation was tarnished by revelations of her addiction, which was seen as a moral failing. According to George Hopkins, who sat next to her at Taylor's funeral, Normand wept inconsolably throughout the ceremony. Ultimately, Normand continued to make films throughout the 1920s. She died of tuberculosis 8 years later on the 23rd of February, 1930. According to her friend and confidant Julia Brew, Normand asked her a few days before she died, "Julia, do you think they'll ever find out who killed Bill Taylor?" Faith Cole McLean and her husband, actor Douglas McLean, were Taylor's neighbors, and Faith is widely believed to have seen Taylor's killer. The couple was startled by a loud noise at 8 p.m. McLean went to and opened her front door and she saw someone emerging from the front door of Taylor's home who she said was dressed, like my idea of a motion picture burglar. She recalled this person paused for a moment before turning and walking back through the door, as if having forgotten something, then re-emerged seconds later and flashed a smile at her before running off and disappearing between the buildings. Mrs. McLean thought that the loud noise she had heard was a car backfire, not a gunshot. She also told police interviewers this person looked funny, like movie actors in white-faced makeup, and speculated that it may have been a woman disguised as a man due to the person's height and build. Charles Eaton was the general manager of Paramount Pictures. Several sources claimed that in the hours following Taylor's murder, Eaton entered Taylor's bungalow with a group of Paramount employees and removed compromising items, either before police arrived or with their permission. Mary Miles Minter was a former child star and teen screen idol, whose career had been guided by Taylor. Minter, who had grown up without a father, was only 3 years older than the daughter Taylor had abandoned in New York. Love letters from Minter were found in Taylor's bungalow. Based upon these, the reporters alleged that a sexual relationship between the 49-year-old Taylor and 19-year-old Minter had started when she was 17. Robert Gyres and King Vidya, however, disputed this allegation. Citing Minter's own statements, both believed that her love for Taylor was unrequited. Taylor had often declined to see Minter and had described himself as too old for her. However, facsimiles of Minter's passionate letters to Taylor were printed in newspapers, forever shattering her screen image as a modest and wholesome young girl. Minter was vilified in the press. She made 4 more films for Paramount, and when the studio failed to renew her contract, she received offers from many other producers. Never comfortable as an actress, Minter declined them all. In 1957, she married Brandon O. Hildebrandt, a Danish-American businessman. She died in Santa Monica, California, on 4 August 1984. Charlotte Shelby was Minter's mother. Like many stage mothers before and since, she has been described as manipulative and consumed by wanton greed over her daughter's career. Minter and her mother were bitterly divided by financial disputes and lawsuits for a time, but they later reconciled. Shelby's initial statements to police about the murder are still characterized as evasive and obviously filled with lies about both her daughter's relationship with Taylor and other matters. Perhaps the most compelling bit of circumstantial evidence was that Shelby allegedly owned a rare .38 caliber pistol and some unusual bullets which were very similar to the kind which had killed Taylor. After this information became public, she reportedly threw the pistol into a Louisiana bayou. Shelby knew the Los Angeles district attorney socially and spent years outside the United States, in an effort to avoid both official inquiries by his successor and press coverage related to the murder. In 1938, her other daughter, actress Margaret Shelby, who was by then suffering from both clinical depression and alcoholism, openly accused her mother of the murder. Shelby was widely suspected of the crime and was a favorite suspect of many writers. For example, Adela Rogers St. John's speculated that Shelby was torn by feelings of maternal protection for her daughter and her own attraction to Taylor. Although, like Edward Sands, Shelby feared being tried for the murder, at least 2 Los Angeles County district attorneys publicly declined to prosecute her. Almost 20 years after the murder, Los Angeles District Attorney Buren Fitts concluded evidence was insufficient for an indictment of Shelby and recommended that the remaining evidence and case files be retained on a permanent basis. All of these materials subsequently disappeared. Shelby died in 1957. Fitts, in ill health, committed suicide in 1973. Margaret Gibson was a film actress who had worked with Taylor when he first came to Hollywood. In 1917, she was indicted, tried, and acquitted on charges equivalent to prostitution, also with allegations of opium dealing, after which she changed her professional name to Patricia Palmer. In 1923, Gibson was arrested and jailed on extortion charges, which were later dropped. Gibson was 27 years old and in Los Angeles at the time of the murder. No record of her name was ever mentioned in connection with the investigation. Soon after the murder, she got work in a number of films produced by famous players Lasky, Taylor's studio at the time of his death. Shortly before she died in 1964, Gibson reportedly confessed to murdering Taylor. Through a combination of poor crime scene management and apparent corruption, much physical evidence was immediately lost and the rest vanished over the years, although copies of a few documents from the police files were made public in 2007. Various theories were put forward after the murder and in the years since, and many books were published, claiming to have identified the murderer, but no hard evidence was ever uncovered to link the crime to a particular individual. Ella Margaret Gibson, the 14th of September 1894, the 21st of October 1964, was an American stage and silent film actress who had leading roles in Vitagraph westerns, often opposite William Clifford. She also appeared with Charles Ray in The Coward, 1915, and later worked in 2 westerns with William S. Hart, The Money Corral and Sand. On her deathbed in 1964, she reportedly made a dying confession to the 1922 murder of director William Desmond Taylor. Gibson was sometimes credited or otherwise identified under at least 7 other names, such as Patricia Palmer, Patsy Palmer, Margie Gibson, Marguerite Gibson, Ella Margaret Lewis, Ella Margaret Arthur, or Pat Lewis. She appeared in 147 movies between 1913 and 1929. By her own account, Gibson's parents had worked in show business. She began her stage career at the age of 12, apparently when her father left, and she remained as the sole means of support for her mother. Gibson appeared on the Pantages vaudeville circuit for over 2 years. In 1909, she became a member of the Theodore Lork Stock Company in Denver, where she was cast in a wide variety of roles. She entered the film industry in 1912, getting a job with Vitagraph in Santa Monica, where she stayed for 3 years. For 6 months during this period, Taylor was acting in the same studio and they made 4 films together: The Love of Tokiwa, The Riders of Petersham, The Kiss, and A Little Madonna. An article in Variety the following year noted that the 19-year-old budding film star had purchased a cliffside bungalow overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Santa Monica. In 1915, she left Vitagraph and went to the Thomasins Film Company, where she played a small supporting role in The Coward, the film which made Charles Ray a star. She subsequently had supporting roles in many comedy shorts and was the subject of several promotional articles in fan magazines. Her first starring role after Vitagraph was in Mutual Masterpictures' The Soul Cycle, 1916, in which she played both an attractive Roman maiden and a modern New York heiress. Other noted roles included leads in The Riders of Petersham, Back to Eden, and The Outlaw. In 1917, Gibson was arrested for vagrancy under circumstances which included allegations of drug dealing. After a largely attended public trial, the popular actress, who during intermissions was the center of a bevy of young women, was acquitted, but the publicity forced her to quietly change her screen name to Patricia Palmer, among other names. She continued to work in movies, but had few leading roles. Gibson obtained many bit parts, including a brief appearance in King of Kings. On the 2nd of November, 1923, 21 months after Taylor's murder, Gibson was arrested at her home at 2324 North Beechwood Drive, Los Angeles, California on federal felony charges involving an alleged nationwide blackmail and extortion ring. She was subsequently charged with extortion and violation of Section 145 of the Federal Criminal Code. George W. Lasher told authorities he had paid Gibson $1,155 to avoid prosecution for a reputed violation of the Mann Act. Gibson was also said to be connected to 2 convicted blackmailers who had pleaded guilty the preceding week to extorting $10,000 from Ohio banker John L. Bushnell. Amid all the publicity following her arrest, she was mentioned as both Margaret Gibson and Patricia Palmer. The charges were later dropped by the district attorney's office. Over the next 6 years, she worked sporadically in bit parts and minor supporting roles, but the industry's transition to sound film resulted in the end of Gibson's already thwarted career. In 1935, for unknown reasons, she fled to Singapore, where she married Elbert Lewis, an auditor for Secon Vacuum Oil Company, later merged with Mobil Oil. How they met is unknown. From the available documentation, the assumption is they met on the dock when she arrived in Singapore. However, in a letter to her dated the 8th of February 1942, Elbert wrote, "Do you remember, dearest, the morning of your first arrival in Singapore, 7 sweet years ago, when I pushed all the boats out of the harbor so your ship could come in, which could be either romantic metaphor, or a hint he was waiting for her there. The same letter mentions a clearly metaphorical female character he calls Elphin, to which Elbert attributes much good luck he apparently thinks they had in the past. Surviving letters indicate the marriage was stable, and she had no intention of returning to the United States. The middle-aged couple discussed retiring in either South Africa or Australia. Meanwhile, they moved about constantly in the Bay of Bengal area in the Indian Ocean, staying in Ceylon, India, Burma, Straits settlements, and Java. In 1940, at the age of 45, Gibson was stricken by a bladder infection, medical treatment for which was not available in the region. With Europe overwhelmed by war and passage to South Africa and Australia threatened by German naval operations, she reluctantly returned without her spouse to Los Angeles and underwent surgery twice at Hollywood Hospital. Her husband Elbert Lewis died when the Japanese bombed Saconivacum's oil facility at Penang, Straits Settlements, now Malaysia, on 15 March 1942. In 1949, Gibson moved to a small, sparsely furnished house at 6135 Glen Oak Street in the Hollywood Hills near Beechwood Village, close to where she had owned residential property during the 1920s. Living very modestly on a widow's pension under the name Pat Lewis, she reportedly almost never left the house, which was behind thick vegetation, limited her activities mostly to gardening, had a dark grey cat named Raja, and had her groceries delivered. On the 21st of October 1964, while still living in Hollywood, Gibson suffered a heart attack at her home. Sensing that she was dying, a highly distraught Gibson, a recently converted Roman Catholic, asked for a priest and then confessed to neighbors that the 1st of February 1922, murder of Hollywood film director William Desmond Taylor. Gibson had apparently made similar remarks once before during the early 1960s. While watching a local television program, Ralph Story's Los Angeles, which featured a short segment about the unsolved murder of Taylor 40 years earlier, Gibson became hysterical and blurted out that she'd killed him and thought it was long forgotten. In the aftermath of Taylor's murder, newspapers had speculated wildly about possible suspects, and rumors circulated that his death was related to a blackmail attempt. Taylor's neighbor Faith McLean likely saw the murderer leaving Taylor's bungalow, and said the person with whom she made eye contact, and who smiled at her, may have been a woman dressed as a man, in clothes which were like my idea of a motion picture burglar. Gibson was in Los Angeles at the time of the murder, but her name never was mentioned during the investigation and no surviving documentation refers to any association between Taylor and her after 1914. Gibson's reported confession does not conflict with the known historical record. Given her documented arrest record along with Taylor's reportedly odd remarks in the weeks leading to his murder, the inferred motive somehow would have been related to blackmail in the wake of the Roscoe Arbuckle scandal, during which the private lives of most Hollywood celebrities easily could fall under highly sensationalized public scrutiny. All of the police files and physical evidence relating to Taylor's murder had disappeared by 1940, and aside from circumstantial evidence, no independent confirmation of Gibson's involvement in it has emerged. Margaret Gibson is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. Thank you for watching Fathers on the Case. Please